Welcome, everyone. My name is Rebecca Pimienta. I'm a social worker, and I'm also the coordinator of this Caregiver Grief Connection project. So the Community of Practice event today is organized by our project in partnership with the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence, the Azrieli Foundation, the McGill University School of Social Work, the CIUSSS West Central Montreal Healthcare Network, and the Caregivers Research Center. And we also have a very special guest today from the McGill Dementia Education Program that I will soon introduce. So our Caregiver Grief Connection project is aimed at increasing support offered to caregivers during the post-caregiving phase, as well as to the professionals and health and social service workers who support them. So we have a wonderful guest for our session that we are very excited to introduce you to. So as a former care partner to her late mother who had Alzheimer's disease, Claire Webster has lived experience on the impact of this illness and how it affects a person living with dementia and the ripple effect on family members. So Claire is now a certified dementia care consultant, a certified professional consultant on aging, and a conference speaker and educator in the field of caring for an individual with dementia. She is the founder and ambassador of the McGill Dementia Education Program and McGill Cares, which is a webcast series designed to support family care partners. And she's also the founder and president of Caregiver Crosswalk, Inc., a consultant.
Rebecca, you muted yourself by accident, I'm sure, but just to let you know.
Oh, okay. Thank you for letting me know.
Yeah.
Did the introduction
we got most
of Claire
of it.
got cut off?
Just at the consultant part.
Okay. Thank you for letting me know, Zelda. So Claire is the founder and president of Caregiver Crosswalk, a consulting firm that provides education and support services to help individuals navigate the journey of Alzheimer's disease and dementia-related illnesses. She's also a member of the Government of Canada's Ministerial Advisory Board on Dementia, and in 2025, she was awarded the King Charles III Coronation Medal for her dedication to advancing dementia education and support for caregivers. And the discussion today will be facilitated by Zelda Freitas, who is a social worker and clinical senior advisor with professional practice of the Directorate of Rehabilitation and Multidisciplinary Services of the CIUS West Central Montreal. She is also an adjunct professor and course lecturer at the McGill University School of Social Work. Zelda has decades of experience working with caregivers, serves on several advisory boards, and is a member of the McGill Council on Palliative Care. She's also a founding member and key part of our team at Caregiver Grief Connection Project. And in 2025, she was also awarded the King Charles III Coronation Medal for her significant contributions to palliative care and caregiver advocacy in Canada. So we're very happy to have you both with us today. Since we have a large number of participants joining us, we invite you to write in the chat where you are joining us from. We want to take a moment to acknowledge that Caregiver Grief Connection is working on unceded lands, which have traditionally served as a site of meeting and exchange among diverse Indigenous peoples. These Indigenous peoples are recognized as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which we are located. Caregiver Grief Connection is committed to equity for Indigenous caregivers and care providers and to learning from and working with these communities. A few logistical points. So we just ask that you respect and maintain the confidentiality of what is shared during our session today. We generally do not allow the automated note-taking tools during this meeting, but the session will be recorded and available on YouTube, and the link will be sent out to all those who have registered afterwards. If you have any questions or comments, you can write them in the chat and we will try to address them at the end of the session today. So a quick look at our agenda. We're just welcoming everybody to this meeting today. And we're going to have the discussion on caregiver grief and advocacy with Claire and with Zelda. We'll have a question period at the end and a short conclusion. So if this is your first time joining us, welcome to our community of practice. Communities of practice are groups that are specifically designed to bring together professionals and practitioners who wish to better support caregivers in the health and social services sector. These groups enable knowledge transfer, peer learning, and skill development, and we offer these sessions in French and English, usually alternating those. The reality is that grief experienced by caregivers is often different from that of people who are not in the caregiving role, and we often don't get that recognition in our society. So that is what led us to creating this community of practice specifically on caregiver grief. And now I will pass the floor to Zelda to begin our discussion.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. Thanks to everybody for joining us today. I hope that you will be able to engage you in some way towards the end of our conversation with Claire with regards to any questions you may have or comments. We're really open to hearing from you. So just want to thank everybody for being.
Can everyone hear Zelda?
No.
Zelda, now you got muted.
I know. What is happening with us today? We're muting ourselves. I was just saying, I don't know where I got cut off, but I'll make it short. Thank you for being here today with us. I'm joined, of course, as you know, by Claire Webster. I'll just call her Claire. Claire and I have known each other for a very long time, it seems, and I'm very happy to be with her here today to talk a little bit about her lived journey as a caregiver and how that has transformed and continue to transform and bring meaningful change to you, Claire, I believe, as well as to what you share with us in the community. So really, I just wanted to start the conversation a little bit by kind of grounding us a little bit in your story and in your journey of how you became a caregiver. Just if you want to share a little bit, I know, but I'm giving you the opportunity to share with everybody else a little bit about caregiving and some of your defining moments in your caregiving journey.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to here today. And I was saying to you earlier, I don't think I've ever really spoken about my grief, like opened up about this. I do a lot of interviews with other people, but never really about the grief. And so I realized my journey did not begin when my mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. I mean, I grew up in a home as an only child, watching my mother be a caregiver to my father, who was a bit older than she was, who suffered from multiple health issues, not cognitive health issues, but multiple physical health issues, including depression, which was not diagnosed. And it was a very heavy atmosphere, to be honest with you, growing up and witnessing all of this. Both my parents immigrated to Canada and, did not want to have any help at home. So my mother was the one that bore the weight of all the responsibility of taking care of him. And then in my earlier life, starting at the age of 16, I also started to have some significant health issues pertaining to my heart. I was misdiagnosed, really not understanding how to advocate for myself in the healthcare system, being afraid to ask questions. So, I really believe that my journey in the work that I'm doing today started in my younger years. And then my father passed away in 2005 of congestive heart failure. By that time, he was, on the right medication. He was a lot more docile, but my mother started displaying some symptoms like behavioral changes when she was probably in her late 60s, early 70s. And I had been pregnant with my third child, was on bed rest with Sienna in 2004 when my father became very ill. And I remember also just being in the hospital with him and realizing that, if you're not in the hospital advocating for the care of an older person, they're not getting what they need. Shortly after he died, my mother's behavioral issues became more significant. And he had been talking to me a lot about her while he was still alive, but I blamed all of her behavior on caregiver stress. I thought it was all the years of accumulated stress. So I didn't really, and I knew nothing about dementia. I mean, there absolutely nothing. And so, after my father passed away, I really had to step in and be very involved in my mother's life. I had 3 young kids. I was working in another field and knew nothing, like really nothing about advocating, knew nothing about the disease. And it really, what ended up happening was we saw a family doctor that referred her to a neurologist because her behavior issues were becoming more and more challenging. And she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease in September of 2006. And the only words of the wise words of advice that we received was "Good luck, Mrs. Webster," and that was it. And it really had a significant impact on the quality of care that she would not receive. The lack of education information had a significant impact on my own health and well-being, as well as the ripple
Mhm.
effect on my family.
Wow, that sounds
Yeah.
like a lot of elements that came into play in your life with regards to and linked to caregiving, and really had an impact and influence on you with regards to that. Is there any particular moment in that journey and what you've shared with us that shaped your understanding of what it truly meant to be a caregiver?
Well, I think when they say a lot of times, people, we don't self recognize as a caregiver, right? I mean, to me,
Right.
this was my mother, and I needed to take care of her. I think it was really, I represented the sandwich generation caregiver. So when she was diagnosed, I had, a 2-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 9-year-old. And it was really when I started to be, at this point, my mother had to be transitioned into assisted living, not long-term care, but assisted living. And it was really that I was getting those constant phone calls. So many things were going wrong. At one point, she had to have emergency hip replacement surgery that went terribly wrong. I was constantly at the hospital, constantly there. And I think it was really when those phone calls started coming, that impact when she was hospitalized. Normally you have a hip replacement, you get sent home the next day. That wasn't the case. She suffered a heart attack and a broken femur post-surgery. She was then transferred to a rehabilitation center where she remained for 4 months. And it was my daily going there, constantly, constantly, constantly. That I think that was that time that I
Mm,
realized, wow, now my role has really shifted.
okay. Yeah, so it was really during that period of crisis, it sounds like,
Yeah.
where you
Yeah.
sort of got that, oh my goodness, this is really a lot more than I thought, or
Yeah, and
yeah.
and and what was challenging for me
Mm,
during that time, I'll never forget, it was in 2008. My son, who was 11 years old at that time, just before my mother's hip replacement surgery, he went to a summer camp for the first time for 2 weeks, and I was actually really happy because I'm like, okay, one less at the home, right? And the first day at the camp, he had a terrible accident and which broke his femur, and he was hospitalized. He had to have like this whole like the iron rods, and he was in the
mm,
hospital for 3 weeks, and then wheelchair and rehabilitation. And then shortly after that, it was my mother who had whatever happened to her. And I often say, I felt like I got caught in this, what they call the cyclone of caregiving, right? I got caught up, I got swept in there. And I felt like when a few years later, when I started going for therapy, they said you're kind of like a soldier at war, where you're carrying your weapon, and you're like, okay, what's coming at me next, right? Like,
mm.
what bullet am I going to dodge next? And I lived in this constant state for quite a few years of like, oh my God, oh my God, like what's happening next to me?
Yeah, it's interesting you should say that. I heard just most recently, I heard someone express caregivers as always being in either a fight or flight mode, right? And what you've just described is sort of like in that fight mode, ready for the next challenge, right? And that
Constant.
energy that goes into that.
Yeah, and the reality is, and I would say this happens a lot. Like primarily, like I won't say primarily to women, but women, we carry that weight of the responsibility. So you're trying to be like the best mother, the best wife, the best member of society. And but it wasn't just about my mother. My husband, he had issues going on with his business, with his family, right? And each of these children come with their own, what they consider their little issues at school, and then
Hmm.
you're a member of society. So you have these friends that were actually, which I'm no longer friends with, but this person that kept calling me and saying, what drama is going on in your life this week, right? So there's so many factors that are being pushed towards us all the time.
Yeah. And in that, I'm, kind of shifting it a little bit to the emotional side of caregiving, right? How do we then, how do you cope with all of that that's going on? Because obviously we know, even with a recent study that was done by the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence, looking at in their recent survey, the high percentage of caregivers that's saying that they really lack emotional support, relational support. And I'm just wondering, how did that affect you? Did you feel it sounds like you did that a lot of it on your own.
I did completely on my own. And you know what's interesting? In the 10 years that I was a caregiver to my mother, and especially the first 5, there was nobody in the healthcare system who ever asked me how I was doing. Nobody, right?
Mm,
And I have to say, to my own fault, I thought that I could do it all myself, right? Like I thought I could do it all myself. How did it affect me? I was in a permanent state of anger. Okay. My father was a very tough man, and I was taught to never cry. So one of my challenges was that I was always swallowing my tears. I would cry. Well, if I did cry, it was actually in my car. I think many other people could probably relate to that. But so the challenges that I faced was that I never cried, and I
mm,
stayed in anger. And when we talk about grief, with regards to in dementia, you're that ambiguous loss and you're grieving. The emotion that I would turn to was just anger. I was angry all the time. And my husband would say how he would come home from work and he wouldn't know like what to find. Like we were arguing all the time. I would be so explosive. And essentially, like, I believe that every single human being has a coping mechanism, whether that be you eat too much, you work out too much, whatever. Mine was the wine, right? And so what I would manage it is, I pick up the kids from school, it'd be at 4:30, open a bottle of wine, one glass, two, the bottle became a bottle and a half, and then you deal with all that shame. You wake up, I wake up the next day and you're like, I'm never doing this again, but you do it again, right? And
mm-hmm.
and I was kept saying to myself, oh, well, I should have permission to do this. I need this. This is good, right? But sadly, this coping mechanism can easily become a dependence, right? And the other part is, my mother was diagnosed in 2006, and those first 5 years of not knowing how to navigate the system, not understanding the disease, not knowing how to I didn't have time to ask for help, led me to suffer a very severe burnout in 2011. So that was when I really had to look and start rebuilding myself. But
Mm-hmm.
um, it often takes our own health crisis before we ask for help, and that's what happened to me.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that very, intimate details of your life, because those that in and of itself is helps other caregivers to with the
Mhm.
shame and the invisibility of what they go through, that they can get help and they can seek help before, ending up in, like you said, a burnout, right? Where everything just sort of builds up to a point where it's just explosive, right? And I
Yeah.
think that's part of what you're doing now, right, Claire, is sharing your story and helping caregivers to realize that it's okay. It's okay to not deal with it greatly. It's okay to have those emotions, but it's what you do with all of that, and how you help yourself through that is really important.
Well, I felt so alone. Like I felt that I was the only one who felt anger. And how could I
Mm,
feel anger? And then, the drinking and oh my God, the shame that I felt. And it was after I suffered the burnout, I went to get some help. And I think being in it with a group of people who were all sitting there with their own stresses and grief and everything like that, and hearing their stories and hearing that I wasn't alone. And I decided that when I wanted to start this journey of doing the work that I do, that I'm not going to sit there and pretend this didn't happen. And I feel that in order for me to heal, I had to learn how to become vulnerable. I had to learn and say, I'm not perfect. This is what happened to me. And if this is happening to you, you're not alone. But you need to realize that this could become an addiction. This could become a dependency. That and I had to learn and really work hard. My mother passed away in 2016, and I had to really work hard and develop the tools necessary to let go of those dependencies. And life is always going to throw challenges our way, and I had to learn how to deal with those challenges and not fall off the surfboard, as they say, right?
exactly, exactly. And I think, would you say, in now looking back, that part of that coping mechanisms or coping that you found in alcohol and in wine. Do you find that that's any at all related to the grief that you may have been experiencing as a caregiver?
Oh, for sure. I mean, my go-to, I think everybody, and I think that goes back to like when I was mentioning earlier in my younger years, right? Like I
Mm,
had been living in a home where there was a lot of tremendous amount of stress. You didn't talk about like if you were mental health issues at the time. And I remember, turning to wine when I was like, that was my coping mechanism as of the age of like in my 20s, right? Um, and but I think what really put me on this path that I am today is I feel that education is so important, right? And it doesn't matter what disease that you're dealing with. When I was diagnosed with my heart issues, I was so unempowered and so intimidated to ask questions, right? I didn't ask the questions of the doctor, you know.
mhm,
And I think that, throughout my mother's journey, I did not know like the first 5 years what was going on and and with regards to the grief, you're constantly grieving. Like nobody tells you that when somebody's going to get a diagnosis of dementia that you start grieving the moment that they're diagnosed, right? Because all the
right.
losses. So
Mm,
education for me is so important. And I feel that, in September of 2006, when my mother received this diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, if I would have been given, or if we would have been given some information about the illness, resources that could support, it would have made a really big difference, and the quality of care and the impact on my life. It's terrible disease like any other, but just to be able to properly be informed and to navigate this would have had an impact on us.
yeah, so that's a really clear message to healthcare providers, right? Is make sure that that you give support and resources to help guide families, caregivers, and the person living with the illness moving forward, right? In terms of how they're going to manage with that illness and what kinds of resources are available to help support them. You know, that's
Something
key.
like, yeah, like it's
Mm,
key. And I give lectures at McGill to the medical students, and I say, regardless again of the illness, make sure you speak to people and using language that we understand, use vocabulary that we understand. Ask us if we have questions. And I know how challenging it is with regards to time, but you need
mm,
to help families understand the disease. And there's so many important community organizations out there and to navigate the public healthcare system that people don't know. So that just adds to our stress when we don't know how to access the help when we need it, right? And especially when it comes to, managing grief. I mean, I remember my father, when he passed away in the hospital, was January 18th, 2005. I mean,
mhm.
I had no, it was the first time I like imagine losing your a parent, right? I was alone. My husband twice now had these weird viruses that he couldn't come to be with me when I lost my parents. But I remember my father passed away at the Royal Victoria Hospital, and they were changing the rounds with the residents, and he passed away. I think it was exactly 6:59 a.m. And he took his final breath, which you don't even sometimes know is at the final breath. And then the curtain opens, and there was a doctor with the residents, and I'm like, my father's dead. Like I didn't know what to do, right? And there was no like, oh, can we support you? It was like there was nothing, like
Was
nothing,
just
right?
surprise and then move on to the next, right? So, I mean, I think in thinking now about caregiver grief, and you're bringing that up, I think that's so significant as an event, and how as a caregiver and as a daughter, how you deal with the grief after caregiving, and we know that when caregiving ends, it's often a profound shift actually for individuals, right, in their identity, in their purpose, in their daily rhythm. Um, what changed for you during that transition from caregiver to no longer being a caregiver? What were some of the major changes that you can highlight?
Well, I think I had more time. I have to say that. I, you know, there were things that didn't change. For me, what didn't change was that I was always on alert, right? I was constantly, I can't even say, it was like, I always had this big pit in my stomach. And every time my phone rang, I was like so tight, and it took 2 years for me to just kind of like, to be able to breathe. I wasn't breathing for so many years that it took like a while to be able to
Mm.
really to be able to breathe. It took 2 years for me to accept that my mother had passed away. Um, you know, it, um, that's a really interesting question. I think the only thing is that that I knew is that I didn't have to go to the CHSL day that she was there, but in terms of my anger, in terms of my physical the way I felt,
Mm-hmm.
it took 2 years for that to change, so that nothing really did, and for those people that can relate as well, I mean, just to go through all this paperwork and all of that stuff took a long time. So
Mm-hmm.
um, I can't really say, oh yes, it was such a relief. It wasn't.
No, and often
It
it's not a
wasn't.
relief. I think sometimes we think, there's a perception out there that caregivers will feel relieved, that the person that they were caring for suffering, and that can be part of that point in time. But a lot of caregivers do tell us that they don't always. They may feel a little relief for some period of time, but they feel a lot of what you were talking about. That physical feeling of being a caregiver is leaving almost like leaving your body. And you're explaining it. It took up to 2 years for that to happen. For
Yeah.
myself, it took up about a year for it to tension, that pit in your stomach, that there's something that you should be doing that you're not doing. That is part of caregiving and the rhythm of caregiving, and we're letting go of that. And like you explained, it's like we're letting go of it in a physical sense as well as an emotional and a cognitive sense. And that's also part of grief, right? Is like letting go of the person that we cared for in a lot of different ways. And we do that with caregiving as well, as from what I hear
Yeah.
from what you're saying.
No, and I think the other part that I really learned was that, unlike cancer, when you're saying, person is in the final stages of cancer, dementia is very different. You could be in the final stages of dementia for a couple of years, right? And I was so unprepared for what the final stages, are
Mm.
what the final stages look like. I think I completely underestimated, like I had no idea what the end would look like. And in my mother's case, she was in long-term care. And one day I remember being in Ottawa attending a dementia conference, and they called me to say she wasn't able to swallow anymore. But I didn't understand what that meant. And I remember like arriving at the CHSL day and being by her bedside for the next 48 hours, going home for a brief hour to shower, and witnessing her death. And again, I felt I was so not accompanied. Like, what did this mean? And then they asked me, would they like me to start palliative care? And like, I didn't understand any of this, right? And that whole and I realized, because in 2020 I had a bit of another burnout session. I realized that's traumatic. Like I had never had time to really appreciate being alone, watching my father pass away and what that entailed. And here I was alone again. My family was able to come back and say goodbye to her, very, very briefly. But again, my husband was sick, so he couldn't be with me. But to witness this, which was so traumatic, even much more so than my father, and there was nobody there. I mean, there was no healthcare professional there with me. There was nobody. And
Mm.
again, after she passed away, there's nobody saying, "Okay, Mrs. Webster, like, are you okay?" There wasn't. So we go along, we brush ourselves off, and with my mother, I did not, she was not a religious woman, so I had to figure out what type of service I was going to have for her and
Mhm.
where and all of that. And it's so overwhelming, right? So it took me 2 years just to recover from all of that.
Right, and the impact that all of that could have on you, right? Like you're saying, after your mom passed, the impact of all that, reflecting all that, and feeling that feeling of being very alone and not being accompanied. As we say, it's so important for caregivers to be supported, to be accompanied, to be informed, to be educated. Are you saying, would you say then that those are important points for caregivers, not only during the caregiver journey, but as they're experiencing the death of the person that they've been caring for?
Oh
Sounds.
yeah, I mean
Mm,
there should be some type of social support offered, and I'm sure there are healthcare professionals from different, there may be long-term care here, and maybe it may be different depending where you're working. But I know that I didn't have the support in the hospital when my father passed away. I didn't have the support in long-term care, and also I think probably more education has to be done, which we're trying to do through our program, is what people should expect, like what do the last stages look like, how do people grieve, like we spend a lot of time talking about the ambiguous loss, and what does that mean? It means how when the person is first diagnosed with the disease, their communication skills are going to change. You're not, it's that quality time that
mhm,
you may have to spend it differently. But what does loss look like in dementia, which we try to educate about, and so that you're prepared, because I see a lot of times, like I was, when a person is first diagnosed, they still look great. They may still be able to be very, their cognitive function is still there, but people can't imagine that, fast forward 8 or 10
mhm.
years later, the changes that are going to happen, and that you're constantly grieving all these changes all along the way. And I think that, I mean, education is so key. And I always say to the people that I work with, you want to be one step ahead of the disease at all times, right? And
Mhm.
I don't know what it's like in cancer education or cancer support when a person is in stage 4, but got to be, there's more needs to be done to prepare the families, what to think about, because then not only are you dealing with the illness, but then if you haven't had these conversations with your family member about what are your wishes with regards to funerals, what are your wishes with regards to just your affairs, it adds another layer of stress,
Yeah,
on the family.
absolutely. Absolutely. Um, I guess just sort of shifting a little bit to, looking at supporting caregivers, looking back, how did being your mom's caregiver shape your grief journey differently? And was it different from other members of your family, your grief journey?
Oh,
And
well, yeah.
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, for sure. I mean, I think, okay, well, I'll start with maybe what I wish I would have done differently, okay,
Oh,
which I think is
okay.
important for
Mm-hmm.
caregivers, and I think that I would have set better boundaries for myself with so many things. When you're a caregiver, especially as a woman, you think you're superwoman and you can do it all and be it all, and you're trying to be everything to everyone. And I wish that I would have, first of all, I wish I would have asked more questions, like when I
Mm-hmm.
wasn't given the right information, I wish I would have asked for more information. I wish I would have learned earlier how to navigate the healthcare system, but really setting boundaries, like picking and choosing the people that I surround myself with and the projects where I put my energy to, and really just being able to say no more often, right? Just like really protect my energy much more than I did. And because I didn't, I really didn't. I was constantly running around like a chicken with my head cut off and trying to do it all until I couldn't. So how was my grief different? Well, I think not only with regards to members of my family, but if you're not familiar with dementia, it's very hard for you to appreciate, because again, for the first couple of years, the person still looks okay, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it's hard to, like, sadly, if you have a disease like cancer, you could see it's physical. The person is being taken, regularly for treatments. That doesn't work that way with dementia. You're constantly trying to evolve and adapt to the evolution of the disease, right?
Right.
And the little story that I'll share is that I was always in go mode, and when my mother passed away, I went into, like, for those of you who've lost family members, and you have to go into the go mode of organizing the funeral, and you're kind of like running on adrenaline constantly, right? And just running, 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 running. And I remember it was exactly 2 weeks after my mother's funeral that all of a sudden, like, my kids and my husband had been so used to dealing with my anger outbursts and all this stuff, but it was one Sunday and we were out in the country, and I woke up that day and I couldn't speak. I couldn't speak. I was almost like I just couldn't speak and I didn't want to speak.
Mm.
And so I spent the day, I just really needed to not speak that day. So then the following day, we were all in the kitchen and my daughter says to me, "Well, Mummy, I hope you're not going to behave like you did yesterday." And I said, "What do you mean behave like I did?" And she says, "Well, you didn't speak." And I said, I, and my husband says, "Yeah, Claire, it's been a little hard on the kids." At that moment, I lost my mind. And thank goodness, so we were out, we live in the Eastern Townships. I went out of the house, I went into this field, and I screamed bloody murder. Like I've never, it's like this howling, cathartic, like screaming like I've never screamed in my life. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere comes this family. This, like, I don't know what, there's nobody around us, but this family comes out of this road and they're like looking at me, this crazy woman, throwing myself into the field with all among the dandelions, right? But I don't think
Mm.
I don't think anybody could really understand unless you go through it, you know? And I guess when I started doing this work because, a few years into my mother's diagnosis, people were coming to me and saying, "Claire, I know that you're going through this. Can you help me?" Right? Because you're trying to find your tribe, right? So I'm sure like with
Mm-hmm.
yourself, you and I connected because we know what it's like. But
Exactly.
if it's hard to connect if you don't understand this illness and the real toll that it takes on you.
Yeah, it's almost like you have an instant connection with people that are living that experience. I meet people all the time, and you do too. And just saying, well, I'm taking care of someone or I know someone, it just automatically you're like, oh, okay, you get it. You get it.
Mhm.
I love your story about screaming and letting all of that out, like just letting all that emotion out.
Yeah.
I think we need to release our sadness and our grief and our anger and all that comes with it. And I think that's a really healthy way of doing it. Although you
Well,
scared me, you may have scared the neighbors, but
I completely, and I think again, as I go back to, being growing up in a home where I had to swallow my tears, like my father never wanted me to cry. I had to constantly swallow my tears. So it was probably, one of those rare moments that I just like I howled, just howled, right? And you can all obviously imagine my kids were younger at the time that how scared they were of me. And it took a while for my husband to console me, but it was really something. Like it was really, really something. So every year, like at the Victoria weekend, when the dandelions come up, I go, "Oh my gosh, I'll never forget that weekend."
and I'm sure your family doesn't forget it either, but I think they
No.
completely understand now that it was a necessary thing for you to do, right?
Yeah.
Necessary for you to release that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I have
that's
to say, throughout all, like I've been living and working in this field now. It's been 20 years. I can't believe it. And every time I give a talk, I say like my voice really represents the voices of thousands of other caregivers that I've met. Like it's often when sit and I oftentimes talk to caregivers, I mean, there are so many common areas, right? It's not, like I didn't have my burnout in 2011 because I was only caring for my mother. It was my life's accumulation. It was, what I've been through in my journey as a patient in the healthcare system. It was not dealing with or not understanding the impact of my father's death, right? It was life's situations, right? So when you go through a burnout, it's an accumulation. And so when I meet with
mhm,
other caregivers, and oftentimes people only come to me if there are when they are on that verge of the burnout. Some people want
mhm.
to really be one step ahead and they want to be educated, but oftentimes caregivers seek support when you realize like I've done everything that I can and now I need to raise the white flag because I need help, right? So
Mhm.
my story my story is my story, but I've heard similar stories from so many other people.
Yeah. And do you hear grief in those stories? Do you hear the loss and grief that caregivers are coping with on top of providing care? And
Yes.
how do you think that impacts them as a person and their caregiving journey?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, for example, when I meet with spouses, the grief that here they are, they could be a couple in their 70s or a couple in their 80s. I mean, although dementia impacts the majority of people are in their mid 80s, I work with people that are in their 70s, right? So now they're at a time of their life where maybe they've just entered their retirement years. They want to spend time with their grandchildren. They want to travel, and all of a sudden, life is interrupted, and that loss of those final spending the final retirement years together, the sense of really loyalty that they have for each other. And so there's a tremendous amount of sadness that occurs, the grief. But I've met many who, like myself, the grief is really the way it comes out, it's in anger. Right. They feel I would say that would be the majority of the cases that I see where people are just very, very angry. And they lose their patience, and they can't, and instead of saying I'm sad, they are sad, but they do express, a lot of it comes out as anger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so definitely anger is an expression of grief, and I don't always, I mean, I don't think that we always associate it that way. And I think, by you saying that, I think it helps us and healthcare providers to understand that when they're meeting caregivers, they may need to, step back and try to understand where that caregiver is coming from, right? That anger that they may be expressing towards them or the healthcare system, might come from a place of great sadness and great suffering, right? The person that's
Yeah.
living with the illness is suffering, in ways. I mean, there's a lot of positive things that can go on in the caregiving journey with the person who's living with the illness. I mean, we know that, but we also know that the other side of it is that there's great suffering that's going on, not only with the person living with that illness, but also those that are caring for them. So I think, that's a really important message that you're sharing with us, Claire, is that we need to be sensitive and aware that anger sometimes comes from a lot of different places, but it can also come from grief. And I think it's important for us to remember that.
Yeah. And I,
Yeah.
when I speak to the medical students too, what I say to them is like, when by the time we come to see you, you have to remember we've probably waited months for this appointment or months to see the social worker, right? And forgive us if we're not warm and welcoming and happy, right? We have waited for so long and we are so overwhelmed. And forgive us if we're rude to you, which we should never be, but forgive us because you don't know what's going on, like the financial stress that we may have. And I hate to say that, but it's one of the biggest stress factors for caregivers and families is the financial, because by the time we get help from the public healthcare system, people have had to probably spend money, higher price. It's that financial burden is so huge on families, right? But
Hmm.
sometimes we're happy to see you, but at the same time, it could come out as rudeness. It could become out as anger. And just to the healthcare professionals, please don't ever take it personally. And I always talk to the families that I'm working with and say, look, you need to also understand these healthcare professionals and how much pressure they have. And, so many people need help and they themselves are just human. So please be polite with them, right? Please be respectful when you're trying to get some help. But it is it's been a long road, and I think, like, for myself, I had no idea how to navigate the system. I had no idea that, like, how do you access home care support? What do you mean I have to call the CLSC? For me, when I was a sandwich generation caregiver, the CLSC came to my home after I had children to help
Hmm.
make sure that everything was okay with the child. Until I got into this, I had no idea that it's the CLSC had home care services. And then for those people that have to transition and make that difficult decision, which again is loss and grief, to transition to long-term care, again, no idea that you have to go via the CLSC. So there's a lot of guilt, there's a lot of grief, there's a lot of anger in this. And yes, we, as myself, you try to find the moments of joy, right? You want to try to embrace what the person can still do and find those precious moments of what the person, like, let's just provide them with some precious moments.
Hmm.
But that cannot, sometimes it's not the case, right? And we know that within different families there's different dynamics. There's a lot of conflict that can be caused among different family members. People handle their grief this different way. People don't always want to be educated the same way. So there's so many family dynamics that come into play.
Absolutely. So it's really important to get to know your family and how they're coping with that illness as a family, and different ways that different family members cope with it as well, right? Could be, a daughter could cope with it very differently than from a spouse, for instance, right? So I think that's a really important message. Just in terms of your advocacy, so moving towards advocacy, right? At what, was there a moment or an experience that made you say something needs to change and I'm going to do something about it?
Yeah. So I started having a lot of coffees with people. It was probably in 2010. And then people in the community started reaching out to me because they knew I'd been going through this. And then in 2011, I had discovered, it was like 5 years later into my journey, I had discovered Alzheimer Group Inc., AGI, where I became president of the board for a couple of years. And I was very involved with that organization. But I was so intrigued by, every time I would meet a caregiver, the first question I would ask is, were you given any information about the disease? And the answer kept coming back, no, right? So it was like no, what were you given? Nothing, right? And
Mm,
I couldn't believe that there was no information. Like if you got heart issues or cancer or diabetes, you wouldn't be told like good luck, see you next year, or whatever. And then in 2011, as I was recovering from my burnout, I was invited for the very first time to be a lecturer at this McGill School of Physical and Occupational Therapy to talk about my caregiver journey. And I remember speaking at the university, and I'd never really spoken openly like that. And there was about 75 students, and I just couldn't stop crying. I was getting through my slides. And then the students started lining up and giving me a hug and saying, "Oh my God, Mrs. Webster, you're my mother. We're going through this at home." And every
mm,
year I was invited back, and I started to realize, wow, the power of education. And other than being invited to speak at McGill, I was not affiliated at all with the university. I didn't go to McGill. I wasn't, I didn't, my kids, my family didn't go to McGill, but I realized, wow, like, how can we have a better impact on the healthcare system? And the way we need to do it is better educate the students of the future. And, I had been lecturing there for a good 4 years, and there was this professor who's still, Isabelle Gelina, who said, "Claire, you really should come and educate the medical students, like more, like besides our school, others, right?" And I was introduced to the former dean, David Eidelman, wonderful, wonderful man, and said, "Hi, I want to come and teach at McGill, and I want to really start educating the students." And he says, "Well, this is interesting. We have our curriculum and we can only do this and this and this." But at the time, in 2016, McGill was thinking about already the importance of perhaps developing a community outreach initiative. So I was invited in 2017 to develop a program with the university that would be there to really educate, support caregivers. And
mhm.
so it just all came together. And I feel that, and ever since then, I've been really advocating about the importance of education. And I feel that, especially with a disease where there is no cure, education is key. And the more educated we are, the it's not going to make the journey easier, but we can be better prepared as caregivers.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree with you. I think education is key, and it's sort of like your ability to tell your story and to share that with others. I think that personal experience really is an important part of caregiving and really important part of sharing with students, and they really can connect with that, right? And I
Yes.
see you connecting with people all the time, so I think a lot of people can really like gravitate towards you as you're so open to talking about your experience, and I think that helps people a lot. I'm just very conscious of the time. I mean, we can talk forever, I think. But just as a close, what gives you hope as you look at the future of dementia care and caregiver support during and after caregiving ends? What do you hope for?
Well, I feel that, as compared to 20 years ago, we are talking more about dementia. I mean, it's much more out there in the media. It's much more out there. I'm very, very proud of what we've accomplished at McGill University with our program. We have a dementia companion guide that's available in 14 languages and has recently been recognized by the World Health Organization. There's a lot of great organizations out there doing great work. I just feel that, probably we need more support from our local governments, from our provincial governments. There's a lot of talk, but there needs to be more money invested in, in caregivers, and also just the resources that are there to support the caregivers. We have to, in the population that I'm working with, a lot of the caregivers are older, and they need resources. Like, they really need those resources in various languages. So, without a doubt, there is much more awareness, but there's got to be more action by our local governments.
Okay, great. And hopefully we'll be seeing that with our next action plan, our next Quebec action plan on caregivers. I think will be very interesting. That's coming out, I believe, in the fall, if I'm not mistaken. And your dementia guide, I think that you just mentioned, Claire, we'll make it available to everybody through an email that Rebecca usually sends after. Oh, there it is. Somebody put it in there. Thank you so much, Rebecca. I think it was you. I'm just going to, well, first of all, I'm going to thank you very much for sharing your story with us and your wisdom with us, Claire. I think it really helps us to understand caregiving and caregiver and grief and loss, and how that is implicated in caregiving, and how we could better support caregivers through their journey during caregiving and afterwards. I'm going to open up the room to questions, and I'll hand that back over to Rebecca, I guess, at this point. If anybody has any questions, I don't think I can see all your hands, but if there is anything in the chat that you know of, Rebecca?
Thank you, Zelda. There aren't any questions yet in the chat, but I do see that somebody's hand is up. Raphael?
Excellent.
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, hi. So first of all, thank you very much, because you obviously shared a lot of very personal details, and I can tell that you're at a point where you're very comfortable with everything, and you're able to share it, and that helps a lot, because I'm a social worker at a CHSLD, so I've been witnessing a lot of deaths, but there's 3-4 of them where I was like kind of right in front of the door, and while it was happening, and at 2 occasions the family seemed to be very open to me entering and being there and trying to participate in the moment of it happening. I think there's this kind of like a knot that obviously starts in like my chest area physically. I start to feel it, because there's kind of an awkwardness and a discomfort that's very apparent, because I'm going to kind of loop it back to the education part that you're talking about, because I find that my question would be more like, when in the whole process of our existence should the education start? Because in my head, it's like, why wouldn't it be in kindergarten, right? Why wouldn't it be in the elementary school? We start openly talking about the difficulty of going through some things, like maybe not to stress out our nervous system, but it's so much, because I have so much to say. Like you said, so much stuff that I wanted to grab and talk about, but I'm trying to condense it into one question, and it's really hard, because it was really, really interesting and very, very relatable. So yeah, I don't know if you understood what I was trying to convey.
I do understand. No, for when you said, you're standing at the door and then you walk in the room, like I was not prepared to see what it looks like for what death looks like. I had no idea. It happens so fast, in the way it's almost like you want to have a biology course that explains this is what is going to happen to the person when they're passing away, right? I think with regards to your field, I don't know if you get such a type of training before you go and work in a CHSLD, because it must happen often. But I would say this type of conversation should happen in high school. I think elementary school would be a little bit too young, but I think that these types of topic should be taught at the high school level. That would be my opinion. But yeah, like the way you're explaining that, I mean, it's very hard to get over. And I had no, in terms of family members, when the diagnosis happens and we're being followed, and as soon as you're being told, okay, your parent is, or family member is getting into the later stages of the illness, what does that look like? Like, we need to know, what does that look like?
And I feel like, if I could just add one thing to that, it's also like the 3 cases I witnessed hands-on, like I was literally in the room. It was such drastically different cases. One of them was a very united family where the emotional work was so, like, it was done in real time where people were supporting each other, and I felt like I was like, okay, this is easy to be in. Another time it was a tense dynamic where the siblings hadn't seen each other in years, and they don't really talk about them. So it's like the way people, what you were describing is like stress plus like the responsibility and the stress and the way that a person learns how to like bodily experience that,
Yeah.
and then the
Yeah.
support, the external support that has to come in. Like you said that the groups kind of like helped you a lot when you managed to externalize that. That part is so hard because it's so we're so kind of like behind on that type of emotional work as like a system, and everyone kind of feels like we have to kind of stay to ourselves. But it's such a like a uniquely different experience depending on the person you are and how you were raised and the parents you had and the experiences you
Yeah.
had, and
Yeah.
so it's so hard. So they're obviously giving one general guideline is impossible, but it's like
Right.
yeah, I guess, yeah. So thank you very much for sharing. It was really nice.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
And I just wanted to add, Raphael, that you're bringing up, that kind of tension that exists in social work as well, right? Like,
Mhm.
we're looking at the caregiver aspect, but also that the being witness to vulnerability and stress within a family system. Those are things that we also have to improve on and work at. And I thank you for bringing that up. I think it's really important that we also acknowledge that those tensions exist in our profession, and we need to do better.
And I'd like to say, because I understand time is going by, but if anybody would like to reach out to me, please do. I would be, very happy to have a Zoom with anybody or talk more about what I've said. Very, very happy to talk to anybody.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Claire.
We will make sure to send the resources, the link to the recording of the session shortly after the session. I know we just have a couple minutes left, but would it be possible to listen to Marie's question?
Yeah, I have time for one
Mary?
more.
Yeah? Okay.
Thank you so much, and I really appreciated the very insightful and personal experience that you've also had, Claire. I'm wondering, being a caregiver also myself, one of the things that I realized that it's a bit more challenging to navigate is when we are a health professional ourselves, and many of us in very demanding roles, how to reach and have the support even by other colleagues that are experiencing the same. I mean, I was amazed that sometimes when my father was hospitalized, where I had my own colleagues and their parents were on a unit, and here we are trying to have our boundaries, our personal, professional, and how do we help each other? And I always thought that would be quite interesting, a support group amongst caregivers that are health professionals that are kind of both ends, when sometimes our own teams are providing the services that we are receiving as family members. And I thought that was quite an interesting aspect to perhaps look at.
Yeah, I think, and you have the perfect person, Zelda, who's like what they call the double duty caregiver at one point, right? So
that's right.
yes.
Yeah, no, I completely understand those tensions, Mary, of being on both ends at the same time, and that creates another layer of of stress. I think on caregivers is like you kind of have the knowledge, so you have the cognitive part. You can access resources. Who you can talk to, so you have that piece, the practical piece maybe, but it's the emotional piece that goes with it, because you're, as I had said in one of the articles that we wrote, it's hard to be a social worker. As a social worker myself, it's hard to be a social worker for your parents, right? And sometimes I found myself being the social worker for my family when I really should have been the daughter or the sister. And so that's another thing that exists for us as well as professional double duty caregivers.
But thank you again, and I would be so happy. Please put my information. I'd be so happy to answer other questions today. And thank you so much for having me here.
Well, thank you so much, Claire. Your time with us is very precious, and we really do appreciate, and your offer to speak to anybody at any time. I think some people will take you up on that for sure.
Please do.
But
Please do.
I'll leave the last message to Rebecca. Go ahead, Rebecca.
Yes, so I'm just going to say thank you very much to everybody for joining us. I'm not going to share the PowerPoint screen because there's not enough time, but I want to let everybody know that we will send an email out with the link to today's recording, the resources, the way to contact Claire, and the incredible organizations and her consulting work and everything that she's doing. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Claire or to us at the Caregiver Grief Connection. We really appreciate you being here today, and we hope you'll take just a minute to fill out our survey to give us feedback on future things you would like to hear, and different topics that you're interested in. So thank you very much, everyone. We hope you have a wonderful day. And thank you, Claire.
Thank
and
you so
Zelda.
much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.